Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of July 22nd, and this is your Monday briefing. We are 105 days out from this year's presidential election, and the biggest change in this race happened less than 24 hours ago when President Biden dropped out of this year's presidential race. This news comes days after the Republican National Convention, which formally nominated former President Donald Trump and his new running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance.
While these developments give rise to a lot of speculation, we're going to focus today on the implications to business. And joining us to share their thoughts are Todd Metcalf and Rohit Kumar here in the studio. And from Michigan, a state he represented in Congress, Chairman Dave Camp. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Rohit, let me start with you on this question. What are some questions that you're hearing from companies right now?
So the question, at least as it relates to tax and sort of tax policy, is, does this portend some change in posture from the administration or the campaign, with now it being the Harris campaign instead of the Biden campaign, in terms of tax policy? And I think, look, as a general matter, probably not, for a couple of reasons. One is there's just not time, right? There's not time for Vice President Harris, now potentially nominee Harris, or whoever the nominee might be. That's, I guess, not as yet fully decided, although there's a direction of travel, to have a brand new theory of the case for tax policy. Moreover, it's not like tax policy was seen as a real liability of the Biden campaign. The things that ended up causing him to leave were not because his tax plan was so wildly unpopular. So there's no inherent need to change policy. And then the other thing is, of course, when you are the vice president of the United States, right, your policy views are the president's policy views. You do not have the political space or room to have your own theory of the case when it comes to any policy, tax or otherwise. So she has, by a sort of adoptive admission, to use a legal term, over the last 3 years, the Biden campaign proposals, the Biden budget proposals, the Green Book, and the like, those are all hers as well. So it would be very difficult at this point to walk away from that and have some brand new theory of what the tax code should look like. So I expect on tax, it's just sort of more of the same.
Okay. Todd?
I mean, I agree with Rohit. I think from a policy perspective, nothing has changed. But, one thing that I think has changed is the dynamic of the race. There was obviously we've been involved in a circular firing squad among Democrats for the last several weeks. And this resolution, as it were, or at least to Rohit's point, the direction toward a resolution maybe, is a positive one, I think, and for the energy and enthusiasm. But in terms of policy, I don't think it changes anything. I don't think Vice President Harris has some dramatically different view on who should be paying tax and or more tax and who should be paying less than President Biden does. And so I don't think there's been a dramatic change in that sense. I do think from the dynamics of the race have changed.
All right. And Chairman Camp.
Well, we've been hearing about how long our presidential elections are, but this is a very compressed time period. And so I would agree with both Rohit and Todd that not much is going to change on that, frankly, going forward. I mean, the Democratic views on tax policy have been pretty much baked in over the years, and I expect that a Harris campaign will really continue with those policy measures.
So Chairman Camp, and perhaps Todd, your thoughts on this as well. What might the impact be for the business and broader economic policy? You're saying not much will change in terms of some of their technical policies, but I'm curious what the impact might be to business and what they should be considering.
I mean, at least when she was a candidate, Vice President Harris talked about a transactions tax. I don't think we'll see her talking about those sorts of things. Again, I think she'll emphasize some of her strengths, which is the child tax credit. And of course, Republicans have supported the doubling of the child tax credit in the TCJA. So I think it will be more a matter of what she decides to emphasize and where she decides to take the campaign. But in terms of broad economic and tax policy, I think she is going to really take the matters that most Democrats have been really using in campaigns for and fairly successfully for a number of years.
I completely agree with that. I think she's going to be. She has been for the last several months, as she's been on the campaign trail, focused on kitchen table issues. I think she's going to continue to focus on kitchen table issues, including, however the tax code fits into that. So I don't think that that's going to be a dramatic shift. I think, we're in terms of the economy. I mean, the economy is the economy. It's like it's an aircraft carrier. The fact that there's a different nominee, in a week than there was yesterday or whatever, that's not going to change the economic, outlook or the economic landscape in any meaningful way. And as we've all said, I think that the policies are going to be pretty well aligned. So I think whatever business was expecting from a potential Biden administration, assuming that Vice President Harris gets the nomination, I think they should expect or would expect something similar from a Harris administration. One thing that is a little different, perhaps, and this is something that came up last week, and that's why I raise it, is she has historically, not while she's been vice president, but she has historically had a different view on antitrust and AI than maybe the Biden administration said. Now, I don't know I don't think that necessarily means maybe she's going to shift were she to become president, but that is something where there has been some daylight, I think.
All right. And we are just coming off of the Republican National Convention. Chairman Camp and Rohit, I'd like to find out from you, what came out of that in terms of tax policy? Chairman Camp, let's start with you.
Well, I think Donald Trump's been pretty clear that he wants to at least maintain the TCJA or even maybe potentially lower the corporate rate. And I think that's almost more of a negotiating position because there are some Republicans that have talked about raising the corporate rate. And the president has continued to emphasize the use of tariffs. And I think that maybe is to help him get to this position of being able to maintain the TCJA going forward. But at least in terms of having a new vice presidential nominee on the Republican side, I don't think that the policies, as we've said with Vice President Harris, that the vice president doesn't really set tax policy. And if anyone thinks anyone but Donald Trump is going to run that show, I think history has shown that the vice president's going to be really following the policies of Donald Trump. But I think J.D. Vance was chosen because he really is about the future and about continuing the sort of policies and emphasis on working class Americans that Donald Trump has been able to sort of capture, that J.D. Vance is the future of that. And certainly his background speaks to that as well, coming from this really hard scrabble youth and really making the most of his life, at least to this point. And I think that's why J.D. Vance was chosen more than for the policy positions that he's taken in the Senate.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it's more about the narrative than the discrete policy proposals. I mean, he does come from the sort of strain of economic populism that you're seeing with increasing frequency amongst Republicans in the House and Senate, maybe more in the House than in the Senate. But to the extent that it exists in the Senate, it exists in people like Senator Vance and Senator Hawley and a few others. But, if you watched the entirety of Trump's 90-minute acceptance speech, and I did, there was some policy in there. There was a lot of other stuff going on in that speech as well, but there was some policy. And particularly there was some tax policy. There was a real doubling down on the TCJA, the corporate provisions, the reduction in corporate burden. There was a sort of indirect reference to repatriation of intellectual property being a success and a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so I think, as sort of Chairman Camp referenced, as we talked about earlier with the Harris sort of tax proposals, the vice president is a wholly owned subsidiary of the president when it comes to policy writ large. And so while J.D. Vance may have some of his own theories of the case on tax policy, he's co-sponsored legislation with Senator Warren, which is not something you would sort of typically expect a Republican nominee for president or vice president to have done. I think all of that kind of gets put in a closet and locked up for the next, if they're successful, for the next at least 4 years. And his policies become Trump's policies, and Trump's policies are to keep the TCJA as is, to extend all of the tax cuts, kind of across the board, almost without exception. There's certainly no exception that's been enunciated by the campaign. And then the question of how do you pay for it? Do you pay for it? How do you pay for it? That's almost like a separate conversation, whether it's tariffs or you deficit finance it. They'll have to figure that out if they're in a position to even be asked the question.
Makes sense. Rohit, Todd, and Chairman Camp, thank you all very much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
And for our viewers, look for links to episodes you may have missed in the description of this episode. And stay tuned tomorrow for more on this year's election with Rohit and Janice on a new episode of Election Watch.
And as always, we appreciate you spending this time with us and hope you have a wonderful week. Take care.